Ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. This is a program on constitutional government, our Friday lunchtime seminar, and the guest today is Morton Keller, known as Mickey, to his friends and enemies alike, maybe. He's a professor emeritus of history.
My friend and enemies.
My friend and enemies. He's written a number of books in American history, American political history, and his latest, the one that's coming out and from which his talk today is an excerpt called Obama's Time of History. He's also the author with his wife Phyllis Keller, who's right here, of Making Harvard Modern, The Rise of America's University. This is the both official and unofficial history of Harvard as it is today. And so Mickey's going to speak on the rise and stall of the modern American state.
I assure you the talk won't be nearly as pretentious as its title. Historians, have a hang-up on centuries. We don't have much of an arsenal of analytical concepts, and the century is one of the more useful ones. As you all know, Father James Walsh, Jesuit priest, published an intellectual history in the 1930s called The 13th Greatest of Centuries. And it had an appendix that was entitled The 18th Worst of Centuries. Well, I'm not going to get into the categorization of good and bad centuries the way Lucy in Peanuts, when she was librarian, immediately rearranged the holdings of the library into two categories, good books and bad books. What I want to talk about is one of the major characteristics of the century just passed, of the 20th century. And when it began and when it ends, something I'll leave out to you. Obviously, technology, science, changes in the standard of living are major themes of the 20th century. The one I want to look at is the rise of the large active state, which became the default model for governance in the course of the 20th century, replacing the aristocratic, monarchical, laissez-faire liberal, tribal sovereignties of the past. Now, I think it's important to recognize that the large state has many characteristics and activities. It's a regulatory state, it's a welfare state, and it's a warfare state. Its growth was fed by industrialism, technology, popular culture, nationalism, imperialism, ideology, racial or class, and it has taken in the course of the 20th century a variety of forms. There's totalitarian, the obvious major ones, Russia, China, Germany, the wannabe totalitarians, or small-scale totalitarian, not so small-scale, Cambodia, Vietnam, North Korea, kleptocracies, which prevail in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and representative democracies in Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and of course the United States. The pattern in the West is very interesting. A study has been made of government spending as a percentage of national income in the major Western states between 1870 and 2007. And it's almost exactly the same rate of increase in France, England, Germany, and the United States. The United States started at a lower percentage of government expenditure, but like the other countries, it's gone up 4.5 times in that period. So that today, Britain's about 44 and almost 45% of government spending is a percentage of national income. In France, it's 53%. In Germany, it's 44%. It's lower in the United States, but the increase is, since 1870 is the same. Now, in many ways, the United States is the outlier in the West. We didn't have a serious history of feudalism, aristocracy, monarchy, guilds, socialism, which doesn't mean that we are the most faultless of states. There were two developments in the 19th century that set the United States apart in a negative way: slavery and its perpetuation, which was deeply embedded in the libertarian to democratic tone of American society. If you can have your own language, your own way of life, why not have your own labor force? And that was the ultimate justification for it. It was a product of an excess of democracy, as David Donald observed. Also, secession. At precisely a time in the middle of the 19th century when most of Western Europe was coming together, unifying Germany, Italy, and so on, the United States underwent one of the major wars of the 19th century, civil wars of the 19th century, splitting. Again, a product of this excess of democracy. Now, this history, American history, persists into the 20th century. We develop a state like everybody else. Welfare, warfare, regulatory, but we do it more slowly, except in our regulatory dimension, than the other countries of Western Europe. And the bottom line, the result, isn't all that different. What is interesting, I find, is that the pattern for the development of the 20th century American state really emerges in the progressive era, and hasn't. Basically, it's been accrual, additions, add-ons since then. First of all, the American state as it emerged in the early 20th century was much more regulatory than it was distributive. Antitrust really has no parallel in Western Europe. Actually, this was a time when cartelization was growing in legal and other power in Western Europe. Also, American progressivism, the progressive era, was much more varied and diverse in its purposes than its state-building counterparts in Western Europe. Politically, for instance, there was a lot of emphasis on expanding democracy, containing the corrupt power of bosses and party machines, but there was also a lot of emphasis on purifying democracy by restricting the suffrage of blacks and immigrants. And that went hand in hand with the expansion of the suffrage for women. The same ultimate underlying social attitudes gave fuel to both of those quite opposite objectives. Antitrust developed hand in hand with the encouragement of big business as a more efficient way of production and distribution. In social policy, there was this theme of improving the working and living conditions of Americans, particularly urban, industrial, immigrant Americans. There was also the drive to restrict urban, immigrant, industrial Americans through immigration restriction and through prohibition. And all of these were parts of what we call, what historians call the progressive movement. In foreign affairs, too, imperialism and anti-imperialism coexisted. Wilson's first term was based on the theme, "He kept us out of war." 4 months later, his second term becomes based on the theme, this is going to be a war to end wars, a war for to save democracy. Everywhere you look as the American state of the 20th century takes form, what you see is this diversity of purposes. Now, I think that these themes, these elements, persist through the 20th century as the American state keeps growing. What we have in the century are extensions more than a transformation of the state that begins to take form in the early 20th century. The New Deal, for instance, is essentially the equivalent of the progressive response to the rise of an urban industrial society, now the New Deal is responding to the great crisis of this urban industrial society. And it responds in a not dissimilar way. It's a mix of oversight, greater regulation, supervision, a stronger state, regulatory state, and welfare, Social Security and all that goes with it. It is a mix of expanding democracy, extending participation in government to the new immigrants and their children, bringing organized labor into the political process, but also an increasing emphasis on social engineering, on government run by social scientists, economists. The number of economists in government explodes during the 1930s, and the bureaucracy. Now, World War II, the next great event in the 20th century, is also transformative in this sense. Out of it comes the world policeman role that the United States will play for the next 70 years or more. Out of it comes a transformative view of the rights of minorities, which sets the stage for the ultimate success of the civil rights movement. And much of what follows on World War II, the interstate, the civil rights movement, is a reflection of the evolution of the United States to be a more modern, more educated, more middle-class society. So what you have by the end of the 20th century is what I might call progressivism on steroids. It's the original progressive concept of the early 20th century now applied to a wide range of activities. And we have the modern American state. Part two. After the rise comes the stall. And I think that we can see now at the beginning of the 21st century increasing signs of a kind of sclerosis affecting the American state. Wherever you look, the active American state is still dominant in welfare, in regulation, in foreign policy. But everywhere you look, there's dissatisfaction with the way it's performing. Again, this is not a peculiarly American phenomenon. In Europe, too, there's growing, even in Scandinavia, there's a growing amount of discontent, questioning of the postulates of the social democratic state of the 20th century. In America, a poll in September of 2013 found that 60% of those polled thought that the federal government was too powerful. There's a literature that's been developing for decades now questioning the utility and desirability of a powerful state. Mancur Olson and Schumacher, The Small is Beautiful. The political scientist and anthropologist James Scott at Yale has what I found to be a very interesting book, Seeing Like a State. There's a kind of pop sociology that appears now that has been appearing that questions the state. Nassim Taleb has written a book called Anti-Fragile, and he argues that what we need are organic, bottom-up ways as against the devil that he vividly describes, Soviet Harvard delusions of top-down policies and contraptions. And there's another one, Nick O'Malley, The End of Big. I mean, these books keep coming out, and there really is an entry into our dialogue of an increasingly substantial questioning of the utility of the large centralized state. Now, this has been happening in the real world, too, as well as in the world of theory in the universities and the disciplines. Education itself, the charter schools, vouchers, homeschooling, online courses, all of these represent challenges to the model of the consolidated, institutionalized way of doing things that was so much a part of the 20th century view of what the state should be. In culture, the internet and social networks, I wouldn't say they've yet fulfilled their possibility, their potential, but you can see it developing as a sort of challenge to single, centralized, consolidated thinking, behaving. In the economy, there's still a long way to go. We still have large corporations, God knows. But 3D printing, challenges to the traditional corporate model of authority and hierarchy and bureaucracy are springing up everywhere. So far, in many companies, it doesn't go beyond the level of furniture and office arrangements, but something is going on there. Now, this is slow, and I'm hardly suggesting we are on the cusp of a major transformation. As Adam Smith said, there's a lot of ruin in a nation, and there's a lot of ruin in a state. A state can retain its power, its institutions, for a very long time indeed. But what I want to do is point to three relatively recent challenges to the 20th century concept of the American state that I think may have some longer-term significance. One of them is in the realm of foreign policy. Second is in the realm of domestic welfare and entitlements, particularly Obamacare. And the third is the system of public employee perks and costs that has come to be so substantial in the states and cities. These are what we poker players would call tells. That is signals that the people you're playing with give that indicate what kind of cards they've got. Let's start with foreign policy. Is there a new isolationism taking hold? Certainly, we have seen an evolving but continuous engagement of the United States in a big way in the world at large. It's been going on for 75 years now, 3/4 of a century. It started with the big wars, World War I and World War II. In that sense, it's a century old. Then it went on to the Cold War and the American hegemony, or attempted hegemony, that stretched from Korea to Vietnam. Then the war on terror and on militant Islam, which stretches from the Gulf to perhaps Afghanistan. And barely beginning the alteration or evolution of our relationships with Russia and China. What form that will take is hard to say because it's just in its beginnings. Well, all of this, from the current perspective, is that this was very much a part of a 20th century long phenomenon, evolution, part of the general 20th century model of the strong state, and it's now undergoing increasing questioning, skepticism. It's interesting that it comes both from within the Obama administration and from libertarian conservatives outside of the administration. I think it's a more general phenomenon. It's happened before in America, but it never happened before. The isolationism, that was the common word we use of the past, was sort of inherent. It didn't play off against a strong counter policy of engagement. Now, for the first time, that isolationist strand is coming up as a challenge to an established policy of engagement, and what somebody has called foreign policy populism seems to be getting stronger. The idea of the mission civilisatrice, I always have trouble with that. Is that close enough?
You got it.
Is beginning to fray at the edges. Americans don't have now a great crisis like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor could change it all, but short of that, it seems to me we're in the midst of some gathering questioning of what had been our foreign policy model for 3/4 of a century. Now, a second area is domestic policy, the whole structure of entitlements and benefits and welfare that have been so much a part of our public life. Charles Lane, the editorial writer in the Washington Post, says the post-New Deal consensus about the scope of federal power has broken down amid concern over the welfare state's cost and intrusiveness. And the poster child for that is the reaction to Obamacare. And I find in this interesting parallels with prohibition, which was also a major attempt at social engineering. Herbert Hoover called it a noble experiment. A modern equivalent of Herbert Hoover, Ezekiel Emanuel, says that the Affordable Care Act will increasingly be seen as a world historical achievement, even more important than Social Security and Medicare. So excessive rhetoric is not dead, but the questioning of large-scale, one-size-fits-all, everybody must, social experiments is, I think, very much with us today. The character of prohibition of Obamacare, in many respects, echoes prohibition. The initial high expectations, the immediate appearance of difficulties, of problems. There may very well be, in the next few years, the development of alternative modes of handling insurance. A lot of people are not even going into Obamacare. And it may well be that the health care equivalent of speakeasies will start rising. Webs of clinics and insurance plans that operate outside of the Obamacare framework. There are signs that something like that is already happening. And the lack of popular support, which ultimately brought down prohibition, seems to be very much present too. I don't expect that it's going to be repealed the way prohibition ultimately was, but I think a scaling down and a transformation is very much in the cards. And there's some question as to what impact this will have on the idea of the active liberal welfare state. Michael Gerson observed, maybe the problem is not Obama or Sebelius, but rather a government program that requires superhuman technocratic mastery. And that is, I think, a theme that has resonance for the large number of Americans. Then finally, I want to talk briefly about a third indication of what might be happening, and that's what Lincoln Steffens called the shame of the states, and which I've modified to be the shame of the states and the cities. He wrote two books about, he collected his journalism into two books, The Struggle for Self-Government, which was about state corruption, and The Shame of the Cities, which was about urban machines. And what he did was attack a vested system, a kind of iron triangle of bosses and machines, governors and legislators, mayors and councilmen, contractors and corporations, dominating the government of states and cities at the turn of the century. Contracts, graft, patronage, bought votes, immigrant votes, this was all part of the pattern. A French magazine around 1905 had a map of the United States, and it categorized the states into three categories: partially corrupt, widely corrupt, and wholly corrupt. And with that same passion for categorizing wines and sardines, it seemed to apply here. Now, today we have, in some respects, a comparable system of politicians and public unions, public service unions, in collusion to ensure high pensions, high salaries, job security, with the membership dues providing the raw material for the union leaders, very much like the political bosses of 100 years ago and more, to secure these benefits from compliant legislators and governors. We've moved from relief to welfare, from fringe benefits to entitlements, and this system, just like the older system of patronage, bosses, and machines, has become pretty well ensconced in our states and cities. So scandals keep cropping up. Correction officers in Maryland and California, teachers in Chicago and New York, and so on. And the political response to this is not unlike that of 100 years ago. It starts in the states especially, then La Follette in Wisconsin, Theodore Roosevelt and Charles Evans Hughes in New York, Woodrow Wilson in New Jersey, Hiram Johnson in California were major figures, and all of them tried to be were thought of and thought of themselves as presidential candidates. Now, something like that is happening today. All right, I'll have to wing it. The states, and many of the same states, Wisconsin, California, New York to some degree, Brown and Cuomo have waffled more than, say, Walker in Wisconsin or the governor of Indiana. What was his name? Daniels in Indiana, or cases in Ohio. But the pattern is basically the same. Politicians feeling the pressure of public disapproval of the system and responding in ways not unlike those of the progressive era, in a variety of responses, cross party lines, and tapping what is perhaps a growing public concern. Now, in the cities, too, something similar has been happening. Rahm Emanuel, after all, came with strong liberal democratic credentials. Then he ran into the buzzsaw of Chicago realities, of the costs, the deficits, the debts, the commitments of the system. And this has been happening in a lot of cities across the country. And I would certainly not argue that we're on the cusp of what we might call an anti-progressive movement, where the thrust is to reduce the powers of the states rather than to increase them. But I do think that there is a challenge to the model that we've had for the 20th century, as it's worked out in the states and cities, that is not unlike, ultimately, the challenges to foreign policy and to Obamacare that I've talked about before. So so what I'm suggesting here is just that, suggestive rather than conclusive. I see these tells, these signs that a model of the state which grew in power and authority for almost 100 years through the 20th century is now coming under some challenge. And as I say, it's incomplete and tentative, and you're all welcome to pile on.
Well, thanks very much, Mickey. So, got questions? Jennifer?
I'm going to ask a question, and then I have to leave, as I told you. So it's not about your response to the question. So this is kind of the standard kind of political scientist, yeah, well, maybe, kind of question. How would we know, I guess, whether you're right, is really what so if I think about 1933 to 1938 or 40 or 41, extraordinary contestation of the rise of the national state. I mean, a program against FDR, roughly equivalent, he's a socialist, a communist, destroying the American, sounds a lot like some comments about Obama now. Eventually, of course, we had a world war, so, there was this exogenous shock, but eventually sort of Social Security folded into people's understanding of daily life. Other features of the New Deal disappeared. How do we know that this isn't 1935 rather than the fall of what rose over the last 100 years?
Luckily, I've just written about this. Let's take Social Security as the poster child of the welfare, of the New Deal welfare. He waited till after the 1934 election, when his margins in Congress grew. He entered into enormous compromises with his opposition, which is the Republicans were initially opposed, but they were an endangered species, so it didn't matter that much. But the Southern Democrats were not an endangered species. And the first form of Social Security excluded farm laborers and domestic servants. Guess who that was aimed at?
Can't possibly
Farm laborers and domestic servants. In other words, blacks were in effect excluded from Social Security in its first form. He did it to get it through, and also because he didn't have great feelings about race relations. And then in ensuing years, that was overridden.
He is FDR.
The Republicans initially suggested they were going to oppose Social Security. Then they heard from their constituents, And almost nobody in the Senate or the House voted against it. Overwhelming bipartisan majorities endorsed it. Now, I don't know that I have to go into details about the contrast with the way in which Obamacare was crafted, conceived, and passed. But I think the contrast is really quite dramatic. And the reaction to Social Security, one of the early Gallup polls sounded out popular reaction to Social Security. And within 6 months, it went from 73 to 85% favorable. Medicare had similar reactions.
Civil Rights Act?
Obamacare has almost never gone over 50%.
Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts?
Well, but that was something that the more Republicans than Democrats voted for the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. The Southern Democrats voted against it. And it was a bipartisan measure, by any measure it was.
I'm thinking about public opinion.
Okay?
To be continued, but I gotta go. Fair enough.
And it seems to me the contrast with Obamacare, which partly because there was a kind of, you know, we've got it, we won, and we're going to do it ourselves, so that rather harmless Republican proposals like a limit on liability lawsuits or interstate competition in the exchanges were not exactly game-changing, but they were given no countenance. And I think that the assumption that there was such a powerful public opinion behind a program like Obamacare, the fact that it turned out not to be the right assumption is a measure, I would think, of the way in which public opinion about the role of the state is changing. That there's much more skepticism than there has been in the past. And it's exactly the same thing can be said of foreign policy. Bush thought that he could really tap a uniform American opinion, a strong American opinion in support of bringing democracy to the Middle East. He was wrong, and there's no question about it. But I think that the parallels here are very strong, and to an historian, they suggest something that's going on that's larger and systemic rather than... Okay?
Okay.
As my friends on the left say, okay? Yeah.
Professor Keller, are you suggesting that there's been a political or philosophical shift in our expectations of the state at some, sort of deep level, or that there's been a sort of prudent retrenchment in the face of our massive debt? Or are they two sort of combined for you?
Yeah. You know, history is not a discipline that lends itself to strong answers that are well supported by data, and particularly quantitative data and evidence. What I would say to that is that it does seem to me that there is a much broader and polls, which is one of the few devices we have to use, do suggest this rather strongly, that there's a growing skepticism about the efficacy of government. Certainly the decline in confidence in the ability of government to get things done from, say, the 1960s to today is abundantly evident. There's no question about that. And that has ultimate political consequences. I think they're subtle. Look, Obama himself is still relatively popular. There was a very strong opposition to the outright repeal of Obamacare. I think that it tapped needs. I mean, one of the things criticism you can level against the Republicans is that when they were in power, they didn't tackle such matters as people denied insurance because of previous conditions and so on, which are minor, relatively speaking. It doesn't involve a large number of people, and it could have been handled by something like hurricane insurance. And it could have been done, and they have to pay the price for that. But that does not mean that there is a kind of wholehearted endorsement of Obamacare as there was of Social Security or even Medicare, which was, yeah.
Of the three tells, I wanted to focus on the entitlements, and it seems that with the Affordable Care Act and a lot of the things that are part of it, even things such as contraception, the left uses the rights language. Women have a right to contraception, and healthcare is a fundamental right. And maybe I'm biased because I'm at Harvard, so I hear this stuff more so than just other people. But I was wondering what your thoughts were. I think that the rights language is a very powerful tool that has maybe, even though there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the Affordable Care Act, just kind of pushes a debate in a different direction, or doesn't allow sometimes, even in the legal realm, the debate to move more favorably for us. So I was wondering if you could comment on how the idea of rights have played a role in this.
Well, I think it's a very powerful reality, and it's been linked to the expansion of the central state in many respects for 3/4 of a century now. And that's been a very strong thing, but I think there is, for reasons I was talking about, the change in the culture, technology, and so on, I think questions about how necessary it is to attain rights and comforts and privileges through the state is, and there's more and more skepticism about that. Take one of the accompaniments of Obamacare is not a product of it so much, but something that's developing at the same time, is clinics. You can go into Walmart now or CVS, and you can get treatment, not only inoculations against flu, but you can get all kinds of basic treatment. And it seems to me that it's a reasonable projection to think that in coming years, the creation of databases so that almost everybody's health situation can be evaluated almost immediately, and the rise of practical nurses, of nurse practitioners, of people who are intermediate but can recognize problems and pass them up the health chain, is a very conceivable prospect. And I think it would make a huge difference in the healthcare of the United States, both in cost and accessibility. Yeah.
You've spoken about the attitude toward big government, cities, states, the federal government. There's the topic of whether Americans want government benefits. And you've just spoken about the provision of healthcare, which is quite different from the receipt of a check in the case of Social Security.
Yeah.
It's quite easy for the government to do. Whether it's easy to finance is another question. But is part of your prediction that seeing something like the healthcare system, which doesn't simply do something like write checks, that this is what is going to awaken people who would otherwise be very happy receiving a government benefit, like the theoretical excellent health care that was promised to everybody, where they could keep their insurance plan and their doctor and get the best without paying much for it? I mean, is that part of your contention, that it's a failure to provide it?
No, well, I think that there is a turning away from the assumption that a one-size-fits-all central program is the only way to deal with social issues and economic issues. Those Oregon studies about the people who are on Medicaid and who are not on Medicaid allowed social scientists to measure the differences of behavior if you were on or not on Medicaid. And what they found is that people on Medicaid tended to go more to the emergency rooms than people who were not on Medicaid. And the health levels of the two groups wasn't very different, which suggests that the elements that make for resistance to necessary health care and to physical condition are the products of poverty, culture, more than of government policy, and are not so likely to be affected by government policy. And that doesn't mean that we just have to live with it. It means that just as, look, let me put it in a big historical context. The greatest of needs, of human needs, traditionally has been food, clothing, and shelter. We have developed systems in this country of providing food and clothing and shelter on all kinds of levels, from the most, you go to the Salvation Army to get people's handoffs, or you go to Walmart and buy good stuff cheap, or not such good stuff cheap, or you go to Brooks Brothers. But the central need for the provision of clothing is there, and it touches almost everybody. Food, the same way. You can eat the sludge that's produced, that's sold in the low-level markets, the Walmarts, or you can go to Whole Foods and feel both morally superior and better fed. But again, that's another basic human need that is pretty well, people aren't dying of starvation on the streets in this country, no matter how poor they are. And shelter too, as the housing market suggests, we're hardly in the grips of a deep shortage of housing. Quite the contrary. So I think that the future of such issues as health care, social security, which were thought of as absolutely dependent upon a strong state, may seem to be less dependent upon a strong state as this century's technology and forms of organization continue to evolve. Yeah.
Of course, that was part of the presidential debate last time when Romney tried to counter that Massachusetts had set up a similar plan. His argument was the one-size-fits-all is not right. I don't know how that debate would have turned out if what the president said somewhat 37 times, if you like your doctor, keep your plan. If the people knew that that was false, maybe it would have been different. But I wonder if there's a counter trend here, and that is, so to go back to de Tocqueville, you have 47% of the population not paying income taxes. They become much more susceptible to an argument of let's expand government programs because to a large extent they're not paying for them. Is that going to produce a political drag on the change that you see coming here?
It's certainly there, but I would place greater weight on more profound and long-lasting impulses in American culture. The impulse to get ahead is, I think, stronger than the impulse to rely on charity, whether it's governmental or private. And that's, deep in our culture. And I don't think it's fading away with our immigrants, quite the contrary. And in that sense, I look at American history for 200 years and more, and the theme of improvement, self-improvement, opportunity, upward mobility. There's a Harvard study which shows that while income gaps have increased, intergenerational mobility has also not decreased. So I think inequality will remain here, and it'll be the big issue of the left, like I think the excesses of government will be the big issue of the right. I think those are going to be the two big issues for the foreseeable political future. But I don't think that we're sort of locked into a system of dependency. I mean, there's just too much in America, in the history of American culture, to suggest that that's likely to happen. Yes, Ruth?
So would you say that the, at least to me, perceptible rise of the ideology of libertarianism is the ideational equivalent of what you're saying?
It's one of them, yeah. I mean, there are a lot of other ideas around too, but I think that certainly the libertarian strand is a reflection of something larger, more inchoate, more diverse, but it's here. It's very much, it's always been here in American life.
Yeah, but it's, I mean, I must say I've never recognized it before. I think I may have told you this very odd incident where really these anecdotes strike home. We went to visit our daughter and grandchildren in Pittsburgh, and we were picked up by them at the airport, and we went to this new restaurant that had just opened. It was before noon, and we come to this place. It's sort of a hamburger place, but it turns out to be a bar hamburger place. And the place was jammed, huge place, but jammed. And we were there with 3 little children, 6, 5, 3, and we came there and they said, oh, it's going to be at least a 20-minute or a half-hour wait. And so my daughter says very brightly, we'll sit at the bar. So the manager says, I'm sorry, you can't sit at the bar with little children. So my daughter says, why not? Is this a local ordinance? Or is this your your own policy? So the guy looks a little bit taken aback by this, and then she goes outside with her husband, her son-in-law, to confer. And I'm feeling a little embarrassed by this. So I say to the guy, well, you see, she's a libertarian, which is true. And he immediately turns to the waitress and he says, that table there, they just sat down. Why don't you move them to another table and put together a table for these people? It looks like a Masonic handshake. I was really thrown by this, but I tell you, it was the word. It was the word. I mean,
Yeah.
you said this, and it was just as if, you know, this was the
Yeah.
thing.
But you can find
the magic, yeah.
these strands way back in American. If you think of Emerson and transcendentalism, a literary critic once said, before Nietzsche there was Emerson. This challenge to institutions.
Should have been enough.
Also, Ruth, I'm delighted to hear that your daughter so takes after you.
There are places
Yeah.
where that would have gotten you thrown out.
Yeah, well,
Not a
take your
separate
chances.
table.
No, but I mean seriously about Rand Paul and his
He'll be at Harvard
chances.
today.
Look,
And that's
He's here.
you know, the crux of the matter. I mean, so.
there are still establishments in American politics, and the likelihood of Cruz or Paul being the nominee is as high as the likelihood of Robert Taft having been the nominee in the 1930s, the 1940s, and the 1950s. It'll be in the Landon, Wilkie, Dewey, Eisenhower, Dole, Romney, Bush tradition. If you want my own opinion, I think it's more, I'd put money if I was the gambling.
You are a gambling man. You play poker.
Yeah, the kind of poker we play is not gambling. I think Rubio is probably most likely, but who knows? Yes.
Where do you see corporations, the power of corporations, the corporate culture, and any possible evolution fitting into this pattern?
Look, Americans have always welcomed the benefits that large, efficient enterprises can bring. They hated Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller, but they loved the lower oil prices that John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil brought. There was an old saying that on prohibition voting, the people of Mississippi will vote for prohibition as long as the last man of them can stagger to the polls on election day. Americans decry increasingly the size and impact of government, and they fiercely resist any scaling back of their entitlements. They're just like Walt Whitman. They're multitudes. They contain multitudes. Yeah.
So there's this book that I haven't read yet, but I read a review in the New Republic and another in the National Review. This is Thomas Piketty's book,
Yeah.
21st Capitalism, 21st Century. Anyway, the truth is probably somewhere in between those two book reviews. Now, if I understand one argument he makes, or claim he makes, I thought you would, as a historian, be helpful to offer your idea on, which is that the success of the United States economically and politically from about the entrance of the Second World War until at least the 1973 oil crisis, a kind of success which sort of people point to as proving that modern capitalism can work as a rising tide lifts all ships, and so that it's a rejection in a way of the Marx and Rousseau and other people's critiques of capitalism as being unequal and creating oppression. His argument is that the United States' historical experience is what Professor Hochschild called exogenous. In other words, that it's atypical, and it's a very impressive but extraordinarily unique blip, and the United States' experience and success is not indicative of what capitalism really is or will be in the future. There's a few different things. The Second World War, the baby boom, and these things made capitalism look workable because in America it did work. And so he seems to be challenging that. I just wonder what you make of that kind of argument, because it's I don't know what to make of it, but it is a little bit worrying kind of view, because a lot of my political position views are based on the United States as having been a fairly good model, success. So he's calling that into question.
Well, I'll start with a concise 3-word answer: China and India. I mean, here are the great transformation, the greatest change in assault on inequality in modern world history has been what has happened in China and India in the last 30, 40 years. Hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of the most abject poverty into something better. Now, is that the product of all-seeing, wise, beneficent states in China and India? I don't think Nehru's India or Mao's China can be described that way. With all the limitations that Indian culture and Chinese culture impose on this, it's still the market capitalism in some form that has made the difference. And I don't know how anyone could really argue against that interpretation of what has been happening. And to me, that is the biggest single historical change in modern history when it comes to inequality. And the rises and falls of inequality in this country are there, and I share the general distaste for mansionizing in its grosser forms. But I don't consider this to be the central issue in American life. The central issue is, as always, to retain that balance between security and liberty. And we've been wrestling with that one, and we'll continue to wrestle with that one as long as we're around. So, I haven't read Piketty's book yet. I've read enough reviews to get the sense of it. I don't know how much pension he pays to China and India, but it seems to me that any general theory about inequality and its relationship to capital and capitalism has to take those two events into account. Mm-hmm.
Professor Weiss mentioned this sort of libertarian trend, and looking at just the recent history of public opinion in the United States and the political climate, could you comment a little bit about how this tension we're seeing right now between libertarianism and more social or cultural conservatism, how this sort of historical trend might continue, where this is going?
Historians have the devil's own time explaining the past. And when it comes to predicting the future, I try it in this book, but that's because I'm retired and I don't give a damn anymore, so I can say anything I want. Libertarianism, to repeat, is, I think, the contemporary variant of an old strand in American life. It exists in other societies. One thinks of je m'en fous in France as a kind of French libertarianism, although its ugliness suggests something more about France than about libertarianism. But Americans have always... Sage de Gourmont was the scion of one of the great French families, the Gourmont family. His father was a diplomat and so on. He was raised in the United States, and he decided to become an American citizen. And he asked a friend to work out the anagrams of his name which would sound most American, and that was Ted Morgan. And he became Ted Morgan, the writer whose work you may know. Well, he observes in his memoir that the difference between a Frenchman and an American is that a Frenchman walks into a restaurant acting as though he owned it, and an American walks into a restaurant acting as though he doesn't care who owns it. And that's got a libertarian tone to it, and I think it's as old as America. I mean, the early settlers who weren't part of this, I mean, people like Cotton Mather, were in the late 17th, early 18th century, were bemoaning the way in which people don't obey their parents, and the kids go off and do their own thing, and it's also anarchic and messy. And it's as old as the country, and I think that the modern world has in many ways made it more difficult, but I think people are beginning to deal with it more effectively. And that may well be one of the themes of the 21st century, but that's the historian guessing about the future, which is of limited worth. Yeah.
Maybe I'm naive, but I've always felt people in political debates over-stress the question of sheer size. For example, there must be 25 or 30 member countries in the OECD, and I don't think, I mean, all these government benefits that people are so dependent upon and presumably, at least theoretically, could be delivered by states or provinces, even localities and municipalities, and I don't think there are any one of those 20 or 30 Western industrialized states have chosen to deliver them through local or regional or provincial governments. Earlier in your talk, you referred to the fact that huge corporations like Standard Oil in the United States, the progressives broke those up. And whereas in Germany, the cartels, I guess, continued to exist and probably never were really effectively broken up. I guess they addressed this by strict regulation. But I guess what I'm really asking isn't this, if there's no example of tremendous growth in central government power being avoided, maybe it's to some extent inevitable.
Well, I do think that the readiness to accept alternatives to central authority is a much stronger strand in American history than that of most other nations. On the other hand, what I can make out of what's happening in Sweden is kind of interesting, because there's a lot of decentralization going on in medical care, in welfare, and
but the commitments to
but
deliver
it's
benefits.
not. I don't think it's based on anything like federalism. I mean, federalism is not a uniquely American phenomenon, but it's a particularly American phenomenon. Yeah.
How much weight do you give to the topic of the federal government's ability to borrow at such inexpensive rates during this period?
Well, I think it's it's been a steadily growing problem, and like excessive corporate salaries, managerial, executive salaries. It's an annoying problem and much more serious, actually, but it's not clear how to handle it. The best answer that we have for the question of increasing government expenditure is growth, economic growth, providing the resources to bring it down. Of course, one of the sources of the influence of Piketty's book is that he's arguing that there is not going to be any further growth to speak of, that there are too many forces operating against it. Against that, one takes the Schumpeterian model of creative destruction, always clearing the rubble and opening the door to new technologies and whatever. And certainly in our history, that has been the case. And I'm not sure we have to assume that we've reached a kind of dead end, and that everything is going to remain the same, and that the people who are the companies that are in power today are going to be the only ones in power 50 years from now. Recent history alone, I mean, the internet and everything that's gone with it, suggests otherwise. So, if you want an answer based on history, it's that it would be that it's much more likely that there is going to continue to be evolution, the creative destruction that leads to growth. Is it conceivable that there won't be, and that we've entered a new era? I have to admit that it's a possibility. I just I don't have the tools to give you any kind of firm or definitive answer. Yeah.
Is there an ethnic divide on this, on the resonance with libertarianism? For example, I have trouble understanding, I have a little bit idea of why Hispanics will vote overwhelmingly Democratic, and libertarianism seems to have a better chance for a home on the Republican side. I don't understand at all why Asians are overwhelmingly voting Democratic. Do you find the same thing happening in terms of the ideological perspective, that it seems to break out by ethnicity, and if so, why?
I don't know how much I can. In the case of Asian, I mean, most Asian immigrants come from societies that do have fairly strong traditions of top-down
Yeah, but don't they
power.
come here to get away from it?
Yeah, but you can't get away from your past. At least that's something that historians like to believe. And I do think that
Have to believe.
that it's, I don't, certainly, look, Hispanics too. I mean, in many ways, Hispanics are committed to family, entrepreneurship, to values that have a ready place in the Republican homestead. But there are other elements that, not least Republican hostility to immigrants, that have worked against it. But, Bush got, 44% of the Hispanic vote. Look, there are deep historical reasons why two groups in particular, Jews and African Americans, are likely to remain overwhelmingly Democratic. But those are special cases. And for the larger immigrant influence, Hispanics now are half again as numerous as blacks in this country. And that's probably going to keep growing. And how they adjust to the near future is hard to look. Irish Americans were a distinct and very large group. They came, and through the 19th century, they voted overwhelmingly Democratic, often over 90% Democratic. And then it began to erode over World War II and foreign policy, over the over the move out of the cities into the suburbs, the decline of the machines. all kinds of rising up the economic ladder, the conflict between an increasingly secular American liberalism and Irish Catholicism. I mean, you can go on and on. Anyway, half of Irish Americans are Protestants now. So you can't talk about Irish Americans any more than you can talk about the Catholic vote. There's one kind of Catholic vote, which is church-going Catholics who are not Hispanic, who are white. And then there are other kinds of Catholic votes. It's a very rapidly changing kaleidoscope, and I wouldn't consign any of the larger ethnic groups to a particular form of political behavior. German Americans, who were the largest ethnic group in the early 20th century, you never hear German Americans typified in terms of their political leanings. And it seems to me that for large groups is the more likely pattern because they are so diverse. The larger the group, the more diverse they tend to be.
I have a question about the irreversibility of progress. Progress seems to be understood as not just as an improvement over time, but an improvement that cannot be reversed. So Obama said made the statement on when Affordable Care Act was introduced, or I can't remember, passed, I can't remember which, introduced, that he was the first American president to deal with this, and he wanted to be the last.
Yeah.
So it seems to be the ambition of progressives to create a kind of progress which can't be reversed, and conservatives worry about this and speak of the ratchet effect, that for all the gains that they sometimes make or successes in politics that they sometimes have, you never really go back. And I see by the title of your talk, you're playing on the rise and fall. What about the fall of the modern American state? Is that, what about this?
I think of Melville's The Confidence Man. Remember that novel? He says in it, the anti-hero says in it, I believe in doing good for the world once and for all and being done with it. Now that's a strand, and it's there, and its appeal is obvious, and its lack of reality is also obvious. But there's another phrase that picks up a strand in American life, and that's being mugged by reality. People get older, they move. The point about this society, or one of the big points about this society, is the way it's churning all the time. Physically, culturally, economically, all kinds of ways.
Did you say churning?
Churning, yeah. As in a butter churn. Right. And sometimes what comes out of it is pure butter, and sometimes what comes out of it is mash. But it's one of our realities. And I think that whatever attitudes seem to be prevalent at any given moment are subject to change. Look, if anything seemed locked in amber, it was the immigrant and children of immigrant, working class, urban identity with the New Deal and the Democratic Party. Then they succeeded, World War II and the post-war prosperity, and they began to move to the suburbs, and their politics began to change. When Hispanics settled in southwestern cities, they initially are very strongly Democratic. They're why the core, the center cities of the big center cities of the South are still not as strongly Democratic as the North, but in the 60% range, not the 70% range. As more and more Hispanics succeed and move into the suburbs of Houston or Dallas, well, Houston is nothing but suburbs. Dallas, too, to a great extent. But as they move into the suburban life of the Sun Belt, it's hard to imagine they aren't going to be subject to differing political pressures and begin to think differently and act differently. I can't predict the pace or the scale of this. I just think that the larger sense that this is what has happened in the past and will continue to happen in the future is strong. Yes?
I have a personal question because you're such a funny guy. Over the course of your life, you must have had many hunches as to what was going to happen or in American history. I know you don't want to make predictions, and especially not right now, but looking back, what were the things that happened in your lifetime or developments that, if you think back to what you were anticipating at the time, surprised you the most?
Well, the thing that immediately comes to mind is a seminar I had with some seniors at Penn, and they were all decrying, this was a long time ago, and they were all decrying the future of the United States. I said, well, let's put it to a test. How many of you think you're going to live better than your parents did? Be honest. So it was a while, but finally every hand went up. And then I said, how many of you think you're going to live worse than your parents did? And Phyllis's hand went up. Well, it turned out that Phyllis was wrong. But who knew it then that the economy would flourish as it has? What is it Eisenhower said when he was asked if he could mention something that Nixon had done that was important? He says, if you give me a month, I can think of something. You're asking me what have I thought about that turned out to be wrong? I probably don't need a month, but...
All you did was mention your wife. I wasn't much in the prediction. That's again as a product of age and retirement. I feel much freer to predict now, to be anything but an historian than I did in the past. There's nothing that's so liberating as retirement.
Well, you don't need to have actively predicted, but there can be things that really surprised you. But maybe if you're so in tune with the time,
well,
and
I think
looking for
what
causes
happened,
all the time, nothing surprises you.
What happened, my generation went into academic life, those of us who did, with a particular ideal in mind. The ideal of, the wise professor and the adoring students and free inquiry and all that stuff. Then the 60s came, and a lot of my colleagues and friends got very bitter. They just couldn't take it. What happened in the 60s was just such a profound challenge to their understanding of themselves and their role in the academy that they just turned in on themselves and became bitter and disillusioned. I didn't have that strong an ideal. I liked teaching because I liked teaching, and I liked history because I went to college surrounded by historians, and history was very big when I went there. And so I didn't have that big a personal stake in it, although I had some, and I wasn't that bitter about the 60s, although I was not happy about the 60s. But if you want an example of something that didn't meet expectations, it's what happened in academic life.
Which surprised you more, blacks taking over professional sports or Jews taking over universities?
You mean what? Which surprised me less?
All right.
No comment. Why not in either case? Yeah.
Since you've been emboldened by retirement and the support of your wife, and you've said a couple of times that you fear less now making predictions, give us what you see for this society. Pick a number, 20 years, 25 years into the future.
Yeah, I'm being an optimistic person, or as my wife likes to put it, of being pathologically fair-minded. I'm reasonably optimistic, you know, in a limited way. I think that the problems that we are going to continue, but I think the basic elements of American society have not been so profoundly altered. And I think one reason that that is the case is that immigrants come, are drawn, and experience essentially the old American, the American essence. Improving yourself. If you don't do it, your children will. I mean, these are very powerful ideas. I was just reading a piece on Chinese immigrants from this Fushu, is it? The province near Canton, who have, that was the classic source of Chinese immigration. And there's been a new wave of several 100,000. A lot of them have settled in Brooklyn. And, you know, it's, my teacher in graduate school was Oscar Hamlin. And when I came there, The Uprooted had just been published. It's the same story. The immigrants themselves go through various forms of hell, low pay, miserable working conditions, exploitation, all the rest of it. The children, they place enormous weight and stress on what happens to their children, and the children are moving along, and not all successes by a long shot, but enough to sustain the story. And I think that's what will continue to happen. That's what most people in America believe. And some groups may believe it more than other groups. I tell you, I worry more about the debilitating, almost degenerative effects of softness and security and affluence on people. I feel for suburban kids.
There's a question over here.
Yes.
I was just following up actually when Harvey asked you about progress. I mean, I'm charmed by your allusion to Herman Melville's political science there in The Confidence Man, where America is likened to the steamship Fidel, that everything is based upon a trust, a faith, a hope that brings us together, and that it's the animating spirit within it, at least within the novel, of course, is continually hustling to trick one another. And how much is what you've described, specifically looking at progressivism and its long lifespan, how much is it a faith that involves some self-trickery, fooling others, and that's what's coming out in these contradictions that we see play out here? And if that's the case, is it sustainable? Does the dream have to die at some point, and reality mugs you and you say, not maybe as bad as it would be to be in Russia right now and deal with the aftermath of that dream, but still walk away from some of that hopefulness?
Well, I could imagine a society in which that could happen, a rigid society, a society without any new input, so to speak, where you have nothing but the children of the people who are already in it. I think, and continue to think, that the most distinctive thing about America is not only the influx, but the assimilative power of this culture. I mean, every other country that gets immigrants we have troubles, and the immigrants, God knows, have troubles, but the process is, I think, in some fundamental way different in the United States. I take a look, for instance, at I keep an eye on the Arab communities, Dearborn and other places, and, you know, it's no different from the rest of the American story. Now, that's not true in most other countries. And I think this assimilative strength is not the product of cases handed down from above. It's the product of the culture at large. And while it gets buffeted by forces of the right and the left, it still is a very strong and essentially apolitical way of looking at the world. And I think that's more likely than not to continue. And on that uplifting note,
Let's call it a day, and thanks so much.